On December 7, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that Chinese leaders would conduct a state visit to Vietnam from December 12 to 13. Caught between the poles of China, the US, and Japan, Vietnam seems to have become a hot commodity on the international stage. What's the significance behind this visit by Chinese leaders to Vietnam? With ASEAN emerging as China's largest trading partner, China has taken great care in fostering relationships with ASEAN countries, aiming to expand the pie for everyone involved. Vietnam, in particular, has garnered significant attention, being courted by several major powers. In September this year, President Biden's visit elevated US-Vietnam relations. In November, the Vietnamese president's visit to Japan elevated relations between Vietnam and Japan to their highest level. Even big businesses have set their sights on Vietnam. NVIDIA plans to establish a factory there. Of course, the interest of the US and Japan in Vietnam isn't solely due to its promising economic trajectory. It's more about their desire, as neighbors of China, to establish a foothold in Vietnam to counter China. Vietnam, being savvy, welcomes all, whether the intentions of the US and Japan are genuine or not. This diplomatic play is quite clever. At this juncture, the top Chinese leadership's visit to Vietnam sends what kind of signal? In this video, we'll delve into and discuss China and Vietnam, China's stance on Myanmar and the Philippines, Vietnam's relations with the US and Japan, insights brought about by Vietnam. Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam is undoubtedly about strengthening ties with Vietnam. On another note, it's likely intended for countries like Myanmar and the Philippines, which have continually clashed with China, to ponder what kind of nations are worth befriending for China. Ever since the Philippines engaged in disputes with China in the South China Sea and the outbreak of conflict in Myanmar, the highest Chinese leaders have not visited any ASEAN country. This visit to Vietnam marks the first to an ASEAN nation since the G20 summit. The significance of a first visit is widely known, signifying a high degree of regard for the nation. Why choose Vietnam? Historical and social system reasons are one aspect, but more crucially, it's an assessment of the surrounding situation for China. Both China and Vietnam are socialist countries, sharing similar circumstances and sentiments. Vietnam has long regarded China's economic development as a model to learn from and emulate, achieving remarkable results. China is feeling its way forward while Vietnam has replicated China's development path. Since Vietnam began its Doi Moi renovation, following China's reform and opening up in 1986, its GDP has multiplied more than 40 times in 37 years, with its GDP growth consistently ranking among the world's top in recent years. It can be said that Vietnam's diligence and progress are striking. This visit by China's top leaders to Vietnam holds two notable international backgrounds: the conflict in Myanmar and the South China Sea disputes involving the Philippines. It's also a message sent to Myanmar and the Philippines through this visit, distinguishing between those against China and those in favor. The military junta in Myanmar has taken wrongful steps, leading to widespread fraud in northern Myanmar and intense internal conflicts among ethnic armed groups. In early October, local armed groups led by the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force launched military actions against the Myanmar military government under the pretext of combating fraud. In a situation where the military government couldn't win, they redirected the narrative of the northern Myanmar conflict toward aggressive warfare supported by foreign forces, directly pointing fingers at China. Prior to the visit of Chinese leaders to Vietnam, concerning the internal conflict in Myanmar, there were two developments involving the Chinese military. Firstly, the People's Liberation Army conducted live-fire drills on our side of the China-Myanmar border. Secondly, a Chinese naval fleet conducted a 4-day friendly visit to Myanmar and engaged in joint exercises with the Myanmar Navy. These actions conveyed to Myanmar that China won't interfere in its internal affairs and is willing to give the Myanmar government a chance to reform. However, should any artillery fall within Chinese territory, the People's Liberation Army will spare no effort in safeguarding the safety of Chinese citizens and their property. Currently, China has issued arrest warrants for 10 leaders of the northern Myanmar fraud ring. This is to signal to Min Aung Hlaing not to attempt rebuilding the fraud industry or acting as a shield for fraud syndicates. If Myanmar can follow in Vietnam's footsteps, take the right path, and earn legitimate income, then China would still be willing to mend relations with Myanmar. Regarding the Philippines, China's approach is different. Unlike the northern Myanmar fraud, the Philippines engages in political blackmail. While China won't intervene in Myanmar's internal affairs, it's inevitable that China will deal with the Philippines sooner or later. This pertains to China's territorial and sovereign integrity. The Philippines has been extremely unruly lately, first encroaching on Hua Hin Island, then Reed Bank, and even daring to send fishing vessels to collide with Chinese Coast Guard ships. Some may wonder why China has exercised restraint without taking action against the Philippines, despite its provocations for nearly half a year. In reality, China has been dealing with the Philippines all along. From January to September this year, bilateral trade between China and the Philippines decreased by 16% year-on-year. From January to August, the total value of goods imported from the Philippines to China dropped by 20.6% year-on-year. In the third quarter of this year, the trade in agricultural products with the Philippines decreased by 12% year-on-year, with a significant portion attributed to the decline in the Chinese market. The Philippines is currently grappling with high inflation. Prices of essentials like oil and rice, affecting the daily lives of ordinary people, have surged, leading to dissatisfaction with the Marcos government. To divert internal conflicts, Marcos has recklessly stirred up the South China Sea issue, repeatedly dispatching fishing boats and warships to the Reed Bank and Hua Hin Island disputes, attempting to gain favor with the United States and seek so-called economic benefits. Little does he realize that the Philippines' actions are simply not worth it. Not only does it provoke China unnecessarily, but it also ruins its own export market, ultimately plunging into a vicious cycle of inflation and self-destruction. Vietnam and the Philippines face each other across the sea. The visit of Chinese leaders to Vietnam also serves as a warning to the Philippines that resorting to tactics for political blackmail will not succeed. The visit of Chinese leaders to Vietnam undoubtedly emphasizes economic and trade cooperation as one of the most important issues. This trip is also meant to show countries like the United States and Japan, which harbor ill intentions toward China, that Vietnam is an immovable neighbor to China. Attempts by the US and Japan to sow discord between China and Vietnam cannot succeed. Vietnam recently experienced the capital withdrawal turmoil caused by the US and the West. The US interest rate hike led to a massive sell-off of Vietnamese dong assets, reaching 5 times the scale before the US interest rate hike, an amount of 120 trillion Vietnamese dong. In the first half of this year, Vietnam's GDP growth rate was a mere 3.72%, far below the expected 6.2%. It marks Vietnam's worst first-half growth rate in nearly a decade, and the withdrawal of US and Western capital is seen as the instigator of this situation. Despite President Biden's visit elevating US-Vietnam relations and Japan cozying up to Vietnam to improve Japan-Vietnam relations, the actions of the US and the West indicate they don't really care about Vietnam. Courting Vietnam is a tactic against China. Withdrawing capital from Vietnam is essentially reaping benefits without considering political values. Meanwhile, Chinese investment in Vietnam continues to grow. From 2020 to 2022, China's total investment in Vietnam was $2.46 billion, $2.92 billion, and $2.5 billion, respectively. The investment growth was slightly weakened in 2022 due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the first 7 months of 2023, China's registered investment in Vietnam nearly reached the annual average of the previous years. From January to November this year, China's direct investment in Vietnam, based on approved amounts, reached about twice that of the same period last year. Although the US and the West are attempting to court Vietnam, the capital withdrawal turmoil this year should make the Vietnamese government understand the true face of the US and the West. China's consistent friendliness and support to Vietnam act as a reassurance to this immovable neighbor, illustrating that the ultimate solution for Vietnam's economy lies in a good relationship with China. Vietnam may learn from China, but it has not surpassed its teacher. Only by fostering good relations with China can Vietnam stabilize its economic foundation and have room to maneuver on the international stage. Listening to the slander of the US and the West and opposing China will surely lead to losses for Vietnam. Of course, for Vietnam, managing relationships with other countries is not a matter of black or white, this or that. Choosing which country to align with is Vietnam's own affair. China will certainly not interfere in Vietnam's internal or external affairs. For the Min Aung Hlaing government in Myanmar, China has sent a clear signal. There is a possibility of promptly mending relations and continuing friendly exchanges, and China will not support those local armed forces in northern Myanmar. Regarding the Marcos government in the Philippines, China's stance is explicit: stop the reckless acts of encroaching on reefs, don't throw an egg against a rock, and don't attempt political blackmail, it's a dead end. For the Vietnamese government, China's attitude towards enhancing bilateral relations remains consistent, especially in the economic and trade spheres, where both countries have ample room for cooperation. Hopefully, Vietnam will refrain from making so-called choices between the US and the West and China. ASEAN's role in China's economic development is crucial, but different strategies will be employed for different countries. When necessary, tactics like favoring one while being cool to another will be adopted, leveraging the wisdom of Eastern philosophy to safeguard China's national interests. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.